demographic trap, age structure correlation, early and later development. Okay, don't say I didn't warn you, this is 3 stars. Thanks, homie.
Oh, Jackson's a big boy.
Jackson, I'm your biggest fan. And that's saying something.
Yes. Too much for him yet to put it down.
Wow. Students, are you going to ruin Jackson's little film project by making this into an unbearable distraction? Thank you. So now in assignment 6.2. Study goal number 46, I have nothing to add unless you have questions. And moving on to number 47, I have to warn you, I have a pet peeve because I believe it's important to honor people's intentions. And I also think that details matter, especially when we're talking about people's reputation and their scientific work. So I want to talk about Malthus, Darwin, and social Darwinism briefly. This is not necessarily a key environmental science issue. There is a part which is. So 2 stars for Thomas Malthus and his famous consequences of overpopulation. He said, if we have too many people in London, I think it was London, maybe I'm mistaken. Well, it's been added to the planet, but in some English city where he was a social worker, he said, if we have too many people in whichever city where he was a social worker, that I think was London, 3 things will happen. And that 3-word quote is like ultra famous, worth 2 stars, every AP test. He deserves credit for it because everybody else has talked about it ever since. Anybody remember those 3 words? What happens if you get too many people in one place? Then forget his 3 words, but one thing that happens is starvation. That was one of them. It's called famine in his quote. And that was actually the first. The second one is if you get too many people in one place. Disease. That was the second one. He called it pestilence. But you can call it disease if you want. I don't care. He called it famine, pestilence, and war. That's right. His very, very famous quote was famine, pestilence, and war. I think he might have called it conflict or strife or fighting. I forget now. Maybe somebody could look that up, the actual quote. Now comes the part where I've got to tell you a little history because, oh, great, selfie time, wonderful, good priorities, yeah. Anybody else need to take out their phone and do a little selfie real quick? Yeah, we should really, yeah. Sorry to interrupt your selfie time.
It's okay.
Wow, that's a good student. By the way, this is the most memorable thing of the day I hear. And then I was an apes. And I was talking about Malthus. Here's me listening to Malthus. What part of this made it so memorable that you needed a selfie right now? I didn't want to hear this, actually. It's probably easy to discuss it. Yeah. All right, here we go. The important history lesson that you need out of Malthus is that homeboy was a social worker. Thomas Malthus was committed to feeding the poor. He wrote a big essay because I think he either worked at a church or some sort of a food for the poor thing. And he was kind of a nerd, and so his employers were like, hey man, could you help me figure out how to feed more starving people? That was the question. And his response was, well, dang it. By the time I set up another food line, there are more new starving people than there are new plates of food. In other words, if population grows too quickly, we can't even keep up with the demand for assistance. He was referring to poor people in slums, but he was not saying, you know, they're poor, we should let them die because they're losers, because obviously they couldn't figure it out. He was saying exactly the opposite. And by the way, if you read his thing, I think it mentions in there somewhere that a really good option would be to delay the age of first childbearing. I think he got onto that. He said, you know, a lot of poor folk, you know, they just have they don't have a lot of other things going on, and they have to marry for other reasons, and so they end up getting married really early, and then they end up having children very early. So I think he even proposed, really early on, that we should find other things for the young ladies to do and support other endeavors so that they're not just breeding.
What time was he?
Oh, right around 7. Yeah. There's this thing called Google.
For a second, I was like, what's a Google?
Life track in the back. Life track in the back. So far, this is not really a big distinction. It's just a detail that comes in later. His job was to help social work. He wanted to get more food to more poor people, and he said, you know, when people are breeding at these exceptionally high rates, we can't feed them in the time. And that's the end of Malthus. Now, how many of you have heard of social Darwinism in your history or economics political science classes? I'm glad to hear that you've heard of it. Now, the problem is the name. Darwin had nothing to do with it. And as a matter of fact, Darwin probably would hate to have his name applied to this. Darwin had a really interesting history, and I wish I had more time because I've read a lot about his early years. He was the equivalent of a trust fund baby, so he was raised by a wealthy family. He was promised a share of that wealth, and he did not want to do the regular job thing. He was like, Mom, Dad, I'm going to be rich anyway. I don't like school. Let me just have the money and we'll call it good. But his parents were like, no. No kid of ours is going to get a handout. You need to find something to do with your life. And he's like, no, I want to stay home and like drink. They're like, no. And so they made him try medical school first, and he totally failed. Man, somebody called me at the school and I gave them my number, and now they're calling back. I'm really sorry. You could pause this.